Action, Sustainability and Supply Chain School, and I am kind of, I suppose, the biodiversity lead with an AS. If we're working on biodiversity type topics, I'm the person who's normally kind of involved in it. So thanks for joining the session. Just as an agenda, we're just going to go through some of the kind of first principles around biodiversity. So what it is, what it means, a bit more information about why you should care about it, a little bit of detail on biodiversity and construction. So obviously that's the kind of the primary focus of Supply Chain School. I'm going to briefly touch on something that you may have encountered, which is natural capital and ecosystem services, which is kind of latest thinking biodiversity, and then a bit around kind of practical stuff about how you can help and maybe how off the back of this school you might be able to do things slightly differently to help biodiversity. So first things first, so what is biodiversity? And just quickly, I wanted to go through some kind of key bits of terminology really that you may hear. You may hear people like ecologists or sustainability professionals talking about, just so you're clear on what they mean. So they are kind of subtly different. So when we talk about species, we talk about it's basically a type of plant or animal. So for example, a badger is a species. When we talk about habitats, we're talking about the kind of environment or kind of sort of conditions that species want to live in. So for example, oak woodland is a habitat. There are kind of specific designations within the kind of Habitats Directive and upcoming Environment Bill about what habitats are. So oak woodland is a habitat. An ecosystem is when we start talking about how different species kind of interact together in a community to kind of create a self-sustaining system. So for example, within a deciduous woodland, badgers form part of that ecosystem. And then biodiversity is the kind of diversity that we can either see within an ecosystem, so the kind of number of different species that exist within that, or even we can talk about biodiversity in terms of genetic diversity within species. And that's important because obviously if you have a species that's got a kind of richer gene pool, it actually makes them more able to adapt to changes. So things like climate change and stuff, if you've got a kind of wide range of gene pool, then there's more variety within that kind of species to then adapt if there's a change. And then, how do species sort of interact together? And this is your kind of classic GCSE diagram of what we call a food web. So at the bottom we have kind of species normally called, technically you might call them sort of primary producers, or you kind of plants that kind of feed into, obviously there's kind of herbivorous species that feed on the plants, and then you have kind of omnivorous and carnivorous species that then feed on those other species, and together they form this web where there are lots of dependencies and that kind of thing between species. So if you imagine if within that food web there, if one thing's removed, then it probably still can function, but it might get difficult or get interesting for other species. But if you start having lots of things removed, then that's when we have kind of problems with ecosystems and how things function. And obviously the populations of species do kind of vary within these food webs all the time. And so basically, you can see there's the graph on this kind of bottom right-hand side that I was talking about, where it's a very, very simplistic version of a relationship between foxes and rabbits. So if you have a sort of increase in population of rabbits, then obviously there's a delay, and then there's an increase in foxes that are kind of predating on those rabbits. But then as the fox population increases, there are more rabbits and the populations go up and down together. That's obviously a really, really simplified version of what happens in the real world, where we've got this really complex web of species and they're all dependent on each other, and all the populations are moving up and down all the time in a kind of natural cycle. And then, that kind of interconnectedness of everything kind of goes beyond those kind of simplistic predator-prey relationships as well. And there's some really, really interesting examples of this. The one that I always find really, really, really fascinating is that in Yellowstone National Park in the USA, some really interesting research done where the water quality of the rivers increased after they had populations of wolves reintroduced into that part of the world. And they worked out one of the primary reasons for that was that because wolves have been extinct for over 100 years because of hunting, the deer that lived in the park had become very, they didn't have any natural predators, and they'd spend a lot of time by rivers, drinking the water and that kind of thing. And what actually happened when the wolves were introduced is the wolves knew that the deer would come to the river to drink. So they would hunt them there. And obviously the deer realised that, and then they would be much more nervous and they'd spend less time by riverbanks, which meant there was less erosion, which meant there was less sediment going to the rivers, which meant that the rivers became cleaner, which meant the fish population increased. So that's just one example of these really complex relationships that we have, that species have between each other, that kind of really in science we're discovering about all the time and learning about. Another example there is how there's in the news at the moment, beavers are really fantastic at kind of engineering rivers and creating these kind of wetland areas that soak up water and reduce the kind of speed that water enters rivers, which actually can stop flooding downstream. So now they're actually looking at using beavers as these kind of ecosystem engineers that actually then potentially stop flooding in other parts of river catchments that might affect us. And I suppose that's where we kind of get into things like nature-based solutions, and you hear people talking about that kind of green infrastructure and that kind of thing when it comes to construction. And actually, as humans, we're as much connected to this system as anything else. So, for example, we obviously, the food we eat, we get kind of fish from the sea, we get kind of grain and plants that produce the bread that we eat. It's obviously in the news at the moment. We use raw materials. So just for example, the timber that's used in pretty much every construction project that is worked on in the world is obviously from a natural source. We're directly tied into things like the carbon cycle, the nitrogen cycle for agriculture, for fossil fuels and all those kinds of things. So we are intrinsically part of this system, and it's kind of up to us to ensure that these are maintained, and also up to us to make sure that, really these kind of conditions for life are maintained in the earth, which is kind of where we're at in some respects with biodiversity at the moment. And obviously that picture in the top right there is just showing how, we've got the ability to affect ecosystems. We can plant trees just as easy as we can cut them down. So we can kind of maintain and restore ecosystems just as easily as we can kind of damage them. So this is just a bit of a kind of summary. So there was a recent report from the WWF about what's happening in nature at the moment. And basically it's looking at the effects that humans have on biodiversity and ecosystems. So, we're changing land and sea use, which is resulting in habitat loss and degradation. So things like, chopping down of natural forests, kind of overfishing and degradation of marine ecosystems are causing reductions in species. We're also really good at introducing species into areas where they shouldn't be. The one that we'll all be familiar with is the grey squirrel in the UK. Obviously that grey squirrel is not native. It's originally from North America. It's basically displaced our native red squirrel from pretty much everywhere in the UK, apart from a few little kind of select spots like the Isle of Wight and Brownsea Island and in Scotland. But then bigger picture, there's much bigger problems with invasive species in other parts of the world, in places like Australia, where the native species are completely outcompeted by the introduction of things like rats and frogs, bizarrely, and things like that then result in natural endemic species being depleted. Species are also overexploited. So again, the classic example of this would be kind of with fisheries, and how we've seen reductions in fisheries catches over the last 100 years because we're basically consuming resources at a faster rate that they can kind of sustain themselves. Direct impacts via pollution. So things like emissions to air, emissions to water, emissions to land that then create conditions that make it harder for species to survive. We introduce toxins and poisonous chemicals into the environment, and then that results in species being numbers being depleted. And also climate change. So this is where, again, the kind of big effects of global climate change mean that the local conditions for particular species makes them harder for them to survive. One of the other things with climate change that is really key is habitat fragmentation. So essentially, you would think naturally, if the climate becomes warmer, then species that are more tolerant to a kind of a colder environment or colder conditions could naturally migrate north. But one of the problems we have is human development. We end up with these kind of clusters of natural environment with kind of human environment and towns and cities and roads and all those kind of things that break those environments apart. And that makes it much harder for species to migrate north or south in the southern hemisphere to those cooler conditions. So there's something else to consider in the construction industry as well. So I appreciate this is on a webinar and you're not going to be able to respond to it, but this is a really interesting picture to me that you look at this picture here and you think, oh wow, that's a forest, that's a really amazingly biodiverse environment. Actually, this is a monoculture. This is a palm oil plantation. Palm oil is in shampoo, it's in dairy milk chocolate, unfortunately, it's in toothpaste, it's in Coke and Pepsi, and actually it's in over, I would say, 50% of all supermarket products. Now, our palm oil plantations are one of the biggest drivers of deforestation at the moment. And just as a quick question as well, if we look at the bigger picture around biodiversity, how much do you think biodiversity has declined in the period 1970 to 2014? The answer to this question is 60%. So in that period, we've lost over half our biodiversity. So we really are now in a situation where some ecologists will say that we're in the next extinction event. So this is actually the last extinction event we experienced was when the dinosaurs became extinct. So now we're looking at a situation where the biodiversity is in a really critical place in terms of populations of the natural world, and we need to do something. So just a quick recap on this section. So, talked about what biodiversity is, and it's a term to use to describe living things. We've talked about the kind of complex relationships between species, how they kind of work together to create ecosystems and habitats, and actually globally how biodiversity is in decline. And there are kind of a range of sort of human things that we're doing that are causing things to decline. And really now is a situation where we need to kind of do something about it and change the way that we're living to hopefully readdress that. So next section, why should you care? And this is where we've got a video, because David Attenborough can say this much more succinctly than I can.
This spider monkey is an unwitting climate activist. Large fruit eaters such as this one spread the seeds of tropical hardwood trees in their dung, helping to build up forests which absorb carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And this is just one of perhaps millions of interactions that guarantee a healthy and functioning planet. Humans have spent hundreds of years documenting life on Earth, and we now have a catalogue of around 1.6 million species. However, there may be 7 or 8 million more that we don't yet know about. We have a good idea of the large animals, such as mammals and birds, but there are doubtless even some of these that we've missed. And the smaller you go, the more species there are left to find. As the human impact on the planet intensifies, scientists fear that many species could be lost before we even discover them. So why is it so important that we protect our planet's biodiversity? When we think of protecting wildlife, we tend to picture the superstars. But the organisms that do most of the hard work keeping our planet healthy are the unglamorous ones. This biodiversity provides us with the food we eat, from the microorganisms that enrich the soil where we grow our crops, to the pollinators who give us fruit and nuts, and the fish that are the main source of animal protein for around 1 billion people. Many of our medicines originate from plants and fungi, and many more may lie undiscovered in remote corners of the world. For instance, there's a fungus that grows on the fur of sloths that could help treat some forms of cancer. The natural world shelters and protects us too. Trees and shrubs protect our homes from flooding, and coral reefs and mangroves shield our coastlines from storm surges. And all that is not to mention the great spiritual and cultural value that nature holds for human beings the world over. But despite the overwhelming benefits of a healthy planet, many human actions are destroying biodiversity. Changes to habitats for grazing, mining and crop production, including the use of harmful fertilizers, have had a huge impact on land and sea. We hunt animals for meat and prize body parts. More than 300 mammal species risk being consumed to extinction. And then there's climate change. This affects the whole world, putting huge pressure on wildlife. In 2016 and 2017, half the corals in the Great Barrier Reef died as a result of the warming of the seas. So, what must we do now to slow down the crisis we are faced with? In addition to cutting our carbon emissions, we must find ways of using land and water that cause the least damage to the environment, leaving enough space for natural habitats to thrive. We must urgently protect the so-called biodiversity hotspots, but equally we should be rebuilding biodiversity wherever and however we can. Sometimes this is as simple as giving plants and animals the space they need to succeed, and sometimes they need hands-on management from humans. In 2020, with the help of reintroduction experts in the south of England, white-stalked chicks hatched for the first time in 600 years. Hands-on management was also critical to restoring the population of mountain gorillas in the Virunga National Park in Central Africa. This included using a proportion of the money raised through tourism to help human communities coexist with their animal neighbours. We must provide pathways for global development that work with rather than against nature, and we need to give the communities affected a seat at the table. The benefits provided by nature are indispensable for making human life both possible and worth living. We need all the riches of our living planet to help us live healthy, happy lives long into the future. Find out more about biodiversity and its importance by visiting our online Q&A. Go to royalsociety.org/biodiversity.
Right, so that's really good video there. Hopefully it's kind of cemented all the things we just talked about previously, and David Attenborough can definitely say it much more charismatically than I can, so you enjoyed that. So why is biodiversity important, just to kind of build on that video? So just looking around ourselves now, think about the food that we eat, the clothes that we're wearing, kind of most of the things that we consume at some level have got biodiversity kind of woven into them. Perhaps more at a more fundamental level, biodiversity is really important for maintaining the kind of life support systems that we have on the earth. So for example, the air that we're breathing, the kind of cycle of nutrients and carbon and nitrogen and phosphorus and all those things, there is an element of them that are just completely dependent on biodiversity that we need to maintain. Things like protection from extreme weather, like flooding and storms and that kind of thing. Biodiversity has a really key role. And again, I mentioned it previously, this concept of nature-based solutions, where we're kind of working with, potentially things like salt marsh in the UK to kind of have these areas that protect our coastal communities from flooding events, and it's amazing because they're not just the benefits of, it's a sea defense, it costs less than a concrete wall. You've got all the amazing biodiversity benefits as well of having these kind of habitats and maintaining them and keeping them where they are. It's the other thing as well, you think about absorbing CO2 and climate change. There's lots of different people thinking about how we can reduce CO2 in the atmosphere. The reality is there's something looking at us right in the face. It does a brilliant job and has done for the past, 400 or 500 million years, and that's trees. They've got a good track record. And again, if we start planting more trees, and we've got all these fantastic biodiversity benefits that goes with establishing more kind of woodland habitats and that kind of thing. Another thing that's really overlooked is the mental health element, and how biodiversity can actually provide these kind of well-being benefits. The NHS are even looking now at kind of prescriptions where people kind of get out into nature and do things. And in Japan they have this thing called forest bathing, where people go out and they kind of they'll be prescribed to go and sit in the forest for half a day to kind of improve your mental health. And it's scientifically proven to be really effective. And again, with scientific research, it's again intrinsically connected with the development of kind of new therapies and drugs and that kind of thing for hundreds of years really. And even just recently, that research has been looking at llama blood and how there's antibodies in it that potentially might be used as future treatments for COVID-19. So it's really, really fundamental, and we really, really think about the importance of biodiversity to really kind of maintaining our current standard of living on Earth. And I think another kind of good metaphor that you may have come across before is the rivet hypothesis, which was proposed by a guy called Professor Paul Ehrlich, which is essentially aeroplanes have millions of rivets in them. They're held together with rivets, and actually, if you pop a couple out, the jumbo jet you're on is probably going to be fine. But some rivets are more important than others. Some are holding the wings on. some might be in the drinks trolley. And actually, there's a point where you start popping rivets out, and there's a point where that aeroplane is going to fall out of the sky. How many rivets you can pop out before the aeroplane falls out of the sky, you don't know. And that's essentially the situation we're in at the moment with the way that we're treating the natural world. Species are going extinct on our watch. We're reducing populations of biodiversity, and we don't know where that tipping point is going to be, where the kind of metaphorical aeroplane or ecosystem in our case will collapse or fall out of the sky. And it's something that we won't know potentially until we've gone past that point. So again, just a really quick recap on the section. Why should you care? We are biodiversity. Humans are just as much part of biodiversity as everything else. And we have a responsibility to kind of manage and maintain that biodiversity for future generations. We're reliant on biodiversity for a really wide range of kind of goods and services and on our own well-being. And actually, biodiversity is really fundamental for supporting life on Earth at a really fundamental level. So we need to make sure that we're maintaining these healthy populations to ensure that actually in the future the Earth is suitable for human habitation as well. So now we're going to have a bit of a kind of look at biodiversity and construction. So I think it's one of the things to note that there's a really fantastic opportunity in construction to drive biodiversity benefits. It's one of the few kind of professions in the UK or sectors in the UK where every day we're kind of working in that natural environment, and we're actually kind of engaged in really kind of habitats, whether it's a concrete car park or a kind of wetland area for some suds or something like that. These are all habitats that can potentially have benefits for biodiversity. The real golden rule in construction is thinking about biodiversity as soon as you can with a project. So if you're kind of really early on looking at the habitats that you've got, looking at potentially how you might be able to enhance things, how you might be able to kind of create spaces for biodiversity on a project, the easier it's going to be later on. And actually in terms of kind of costs and that kind of thing, it's not going to be that kind of added cost that sometimes gets thrown around. It just becomes part of delivering the project in the first place, creating these spaces for biodiversity. So, that it's really the fundamental that you need to think about these things as soon as possible, so they just get kind of built in as part of what you do instead of a kind of tacked add-on that becomes a hindrance to delivering other elements of what you're trying to do. And just to some examples of some of the things that you can potentially get involved with. So obviously, when you think about groundworks and site preparation, there's things like kind of devegetation and that kind of thing, doing those things in the right way to make sure that you're not affecting any potentially protected species or habitats or anything like that. You can look at your materials. So when you're purchasing materials, are you buying things that have got kind of good credence when it comes to biodiversity? So that the classic is looking at FSC timber. If you buy FSC timber, then you know that you're buying timber that's from a source that's been sustainably managed, and hopefully, part of that sustainable management is ensuring there's habitats maintained for biodiversity. The other big one is the kind of mining and quarrying of materials, be it, steel, be it aggregate, where is it coming from? There are other standards that you can look at for that. So things like BS 6001 aggregates and other kind of various standards that you can look at in terms of mining and quarrying, and actually fundamentally trying to reduce the amount of those materials, reducing waste, reducing what you need in the first place, because then you're kind of stopping that demand and you're kind of reducing the kind of impacts further down the line. Which again, reducing waste is fundamental to kind of making sure that you're more efficient with what you've got. When you're looking at the kind of machinery that you have, is it being maintained properly? Obviously, if you've got a machine that's dropping oil, or potentially even the chemicals that you're storing, things like that, and they're kind of leaching into the environment, that can create some really significant problems. That can potentially get into trouble with legally as well. So not advised. And this is where you're looking at your kind of discharges of potentially, if you've got kind of sediments on site or anything like that, you're making sure you're within discharge limits to make sure that that's all above board. And obviously, if you're doing that, you're reducing impacts to biodiversity. And then again, if there's any unplanned accidents or anything like that, have you got plans in place? Do you have people that kind of know what they need to do if you have an unforeseen event that results in a discharge of something into the environment, so you can kind of act on it quickly and make sure those impacts are minimised as much as possible? Just a really quick note, obviously there is a lot of kind of legal stuff around biodiversity. I'm not going to go into loads of detail, and these are kind of things that when you have ecology surveys and ecologists on projects, they kind of pick up on. But obviously, we have protected species, things like great crested newts and classics. Obviously, badgers have their own specific designations, and nesting birds are protected, bats as well. These are all species that if you find on construction sites, then you need to have a plan in place, and you need to make sure they're dealt with in the right way. And if they're not, then potentially you might fall foul of the law. The other one's obviously tree protection zones when it comes to kind of species, and actually the kind of wider piece around, designated areas that are protected, things like triple SIs, SPAs, SACs, all that kind of stuff. But obviously these are things that are picked up in your kind of initial kind of surveys on projects and that kind of thing. So if you've got any questions from the legal side, it's always best to ask the question. It's always best, get the ecologist involved if they're not, and kind of make sure you're dealing with them in the right way. The flip side to biodiversity in the law, which is again quite an interesting one that crops up, is invasive species. So these are species that are kind of not native, potentially really damaging, can potentially cause you some big problems. They again need to be dealt with in the right way legally. You can see in the bottom right hand corner in the red box, that's some Japanese knotweed poking up through some concrete. Obviously, if you have Japanese knotweed on the site, then there are specialist contractors that will deal with that for you. It's potentially quite a tricky situation. Obviously there are ways of dealing with Japanese knotweed it's to make sure it's done the right way, to make sure it doesn't spread, to make sure that it can be kind of got rid of without causing damage to the kind of wider environment. So really important if you find invasive species like that. Obviously there's other ones like Himalayan balsam, like giant hogweed, again, that ecologists should pick up on, that you need to be aware of. And then again, when you're dealing with biodiversity in construction, I think that the big picture is to think about the biodiversity mitigation hierarchy. And this is essentially where you're looking at, so if you've got species and habitats, what's your most preferable option to your least preferable. So your most preferable is just to avoid that area in the first place. So this is, when we start talking about tree protection zones, or if you've got like a pond or a wetland area or anything like that on the site, then you try and avoid impact to the area as much as you possibly can. If you can't do that, then you minimize those impacts. So for example, if you have to do devegetation works, then you kind of cut once at a specified level. That then gives you opportunity for any kind of lizards or kind of small mammals that are living there to kind of escape to a different area, and then you come back and you cut it again. If there are habitats that are destroyed, then you look at restoring them, as close to where they were in the first place as possible. And then if restoration isn't possible, then as a last resort, you look at offsetting that impact. And this is where we start talking about things like biodiversity net gain, which you may well be aware of. But essentially, biodiversity net gain is a new piece of legislation that's going to be in the new Environment Act. Essentially, what it says is that construction projects are now going to have to deliver 10% more biodiversity units than they kind of get rid of in the first place. So how is a biodiversity unit calculated? DEFRA have created a thing called the biodiversity metric. It's on version 3 at the moment. If you type that into Google, you'll find it. This works on a habitat level. So again, it's looking at sort of classic. There are set classifications of what habitats are. So I've talked about oak woodland, which is one. Things like chalk grassland as well. And this is decided by an ecologist. The ecologist will run the calculation using the metric and specialist knowledge to understand what habitats you have on site. They will give you calculate a baseline before you do the work, so you understand what you have. And then you can then run another calculation when the work's done to say, well, what are we going to have when this is finished? And then the law will say you need to make sure that you have a 10% increase from before to after. These habitats need to be maintained for 30 years, and there needs to be a plan to make sure essentially that they're kind of maintained for that period. Again, just looking at how net gain kind of works, the graph on the left-hand side kind of shows how, on a typical construction project, you've got your negative impact from a construction project, let's say, then you look at what you can avoid as a priority. Then you look at what you can minimize as the next bit, you look at what you can restore, and then the offset bit at the top, which is kind of how net gain gets involved, is your 10% increase. Just as another note, I suppose at the moment, I say net gain is England and Wales, and the kind of Scottish government are looking at a very similar scheme, which is called positive effects of biodiversity. So again, if you're working in Scotland, important, keep your pulse on what the kind of latest legal sort of situation is with net gains. It's something that is likely to become part of kind of Scottish law as well, but at the moment it isn't. So just going to quickly talk about natural capital and ecosystem services, which again is something you may well have encountered, just to give you a kind of grounding on what it is and what the terms mean, and how potentially they're going to be used in the future to kind of talk about biodiversity and impacts and that sort of stuff. Natural capital is essentially the kind of world stock of natural resources that might be utilised for human needs. So, we're talking about resources, and these are kind of renewable and non-renewable materials. So we're talking about everything here from kind of clean air that we need, from the timber in forests to potentially cod in the North Sea, to even fossil fuels, because obviously when you think about fossil fuels, they are like they're essentially fossilized wood, fossilized algae from millions of years ago, and they are essentially derived from biodiversity. And then they're also defined as sinks as well. So these are the kind of things that absorb or neutralize or recycle waste. So, for example, in Cornwall, they're actually even today using reed beds as kind of a resource to kind of they use this to this day. There's mine waste that kind of flows out of old tin mines, and actually use the reed beds to clean up that water and make sure that it's at a safe level when it enters a river. And just as an interesting sort of note, you can actually put a financial figure on the kind of natural capital. And in 2019, the Office of National Statistics estimated that the UK natural capital equates to 1.2 trillion pounds, which is obviously many times GDP. Nature is worth a lot of money just in terms of the stocks to us. And also ecosystem services. And ecosystem services are, the services that we get provided for free by nature. They make human life possible, and they make it worth living. And these are divided into 4 categories. So we have provisioning ecosystem services that are kind of the products that we get. So food would be one, energy materials might be another one, like coal, if we wanted to kind of go that far. Regulating, which are kind of obviously the kind of natural cycles that we depend on for kind of the kind of natural equilibriums to be maintained. Things like purification of water and air and that sort of thing. Supporting services, which kind of support other ecosystem services, and the kind of cultural elements too. So this is the kind of more sort of intangible well-being and kind of recreational benefits that we get from biodiversity as well. So, for example, some ecosystem services, things like pollination from bees, obviously essential for. If we didn't have pollination, then your trip to the supermarket would look very different when you walk down the kind of fresh vegetables and fruit aisles. Things like photosynthesis, absorbing CO2. It's fundamental for reducing CO2 in the atmosphere. We talked about how beavers can attenuate water in river catchments to stop flooding, and obviously talked about the well-being before as well. And obviously, conservatively, there's been estimates about what ecosystem services provide the world, and conservatively, it's been valued at $33 trillion, which is around twice the kind of global gross national product. So again, twice what we put in, we get back from nature, and we're kind of, I suppose, a slightly sad situation. We're kind of reducing that all the time because we're having a negative impact on biodiversity. So again, it's interesting to just think about natural capital and ecosystem services and kind of, I guess the kind of good points and bad points of them. So I think from one side of things, it does enable sort of decision makers and governments to kind of try and account for nature's role in our economy and kind of, human well-being. And it can also help businesses kind of inform your sustainability reports. It can help you think about risk. It can help you think about, I guess, kind of your supply chains and what's happening there. From a flip side of that, I think, it's an interesting concept, but, should we be commodifying nature? One of the reasons why we're destroying nature is we're kind of commodifying everything. And as soon as you put a value on something, you can kind of have an argument about, should we keep it, should we get rid of it? And actually, we don't understand everythting about the natural world. We don't understand everything about how these cycles work. And as soon as we start trying to put a value on it, not fully understanding it, then it's quite a strange kind of thing to do. And actually also, should we be trying to put a human value or need over biodiversity? Should it have a right to kind of exist as much as we do? So it becomes quite an interesting philosophical argument if you kind of want to get into the kind of the depths of it. It's interesting because I think within the kind of commercial business world, it's very much, it's seen as a good thing and seen as something that people can really get their teeth into. But once you start talking about it at an academic level, it's much more kind of diverse opinions about, is this the right way for us to be thinking about nature? So how can you help? So I'm just going to put a few things up. So obviously there's simple things like, on construction projects, you can look at potentially creating new spaces for nature, even permanently or temporarily. I've been on construction sites where, there've been guys on site and they've got some bits of scrap wood and they've put up a few bird boxes and a few bird tables, and they've, created a little space just by the cabins they've got where they can put some things up so that you create some spaces for nature. I think these bird boxes are quite interesting because they're actually made out of old bits of ducting from from an aeroplane. So they're, reusing scrap materials to create something that's useful and create something that then actually goes on to help biodiversity. So again, using that example, you potentially look at what scrap materials you've got and how they might be able to be used to create, bird boxes or higher vernacular like bug hotels and things like that. And all these little things, over at big scale can make a really big difference. Again, I think it's really important to be really efficient with what we have. It's really important to kind of reduce our consumption of raw materials and of kind of, basically make the best use of the things that we already have. So kind of making, doing, mend with things, trying to kind of eke things out for longer is definitely a way of reducing our consumption of raw materials and reducing our impacts on biodiversity. Looking at new technologies and new ways of building. So, green walls and that kind of stuff can be a really fantastic way of trying to introduce a habitat into the built environment and trying to create space for nature where maybe there wasn't any before. So, green roofs, green walls, those kinds of things can be really good ways of trying to bring that into a traditional development. We can look at alternative materials. So plasphalt is a new material that's actually, obviously used in road construction, includes in the name, but it's basically, again, trying to reduce our consumption of raw materials, trying to look at using waste plastic in road building materials. And, there's lots of different examples of this. You can look at, building stand that has levels of recycled glass in it, or even kind of recycled aggregates and all that kind of thing, which are reducing our consumption of raw materials, which again reduces our impacts on biodiversity. Again, we can talks about nature-based solutions, but this is a really fundamental one. We're on bigger projects where you have to have drainage schemes and that kind of thing. Why not look at a drainage scheme that also creates some really fantastic habitats for biodiversity? So this is an example here of a SUD scheme. SUDs can be a really, really good way of trying to introduce a bit of green infrastructure into a project. So, here they've got a pond, they've created a kind of wildlife habitat, use native plants and that kind of thing within the housing development that solves the problem of drainage, but also creates that space for nature as well. And then also just from a perspective of, kind of design and building, looking at a more circular model where at the moment we have a very linear, kind of take, make, and then throw away. But actually, if we create a kind of circular economy where we're looking more at reuse and recycling of materials, instead of that, kind of just consuming new all the time, then it essentially, what it will do is reduce our consumption of raw materials and reduce our impacts on biodiversity. And then, again, creating more space for nature. So example here of, we don't necessarily have to manage every single scrap of land to an inch of its life. Actually, there's an example here. I live in Bristol, so this is in Bath. So nearby Bath City Council, they have these areas called Let's Get Buzzing, and they just leave areas of the parkland to kind of grow wild. And it's really, really amazing when you see them, because the amount of wildlife in that small scrap of area, which might be 5 meters by 5 meters, is orders of magnitude more than the kind of grassland, park next to it. And obviously there needs to be space for everything. There needs to be space for people to walk their dogs, to kick a football around and play frisbee and stuff. But creating a bit more space for nature does have a big impact, and actually potentially saves money as well, because if there's less area to be maintained, if there's, you have to pay someone less often to go and cut the grass and that kind of thing, so it can have benefits as well. And also, again, just using materials that are, accredited. So talked about FSC, and then the other one, kind of trying to just use a bit more due diligence when it comes to choosing some materials that we have, so that they are, sourced in a more responsible way. So, for example, like palm oil free if you can as well. So that's the end of the session. If anybody does have any questions, I'm more than happy to answer them in the Q&A. Is there any way to quantify green space created at work? Well, that's an interesting one. So yeah, you can quantify areas of different habitats using the biodiversity metric. So you can use, basically you have your area, and then you can try and classify the habitat based on the species that you have within the area. So yes, you can, but it's something that if you were just doing it informally, then you could do it yourselves. But if you were doing it and it was something that you would need to rely on for, reporting to a client or reporting externally, I would recommend that you use an ecologist to do that. So you're more than welcome to check out the biodiversity metric online using DEFRA and kind of do your own calculation with that. But beyond that, I'd probably speak to an ecologist, if that helps.
We've got another question in the Q&A. Which habitats are classified as irreplaceable in the net?
I think it's really, maybe something I should have mentioned is obviously it's really looking at what your local conditions are is probably really, really important, and understanding if there are any kind of protected areas or nature reserves or anything in your local environment could be a really good way of maybe trying to think a bit more specifically about how you might be able to help biodiversity. So, for example, I spoke about kind of connectivity of habitats, and it's a big thing at the moment, especially with climate change, how, we have these fragments of natural areas that are kind of split up and are, isolated, which means that populations are isolated, which sort of creates problems around, inbreeding and that kind of thing. And actually, if you were able to kind of locally think about, well, we know there's these protected areas in the area, and maybe if you manage some land or some area that might try and connect them a bit more, you could say, well, we know there's a grassland habitat here and a grassland habitat there, so why don't we try and create a bit of grassland habitat in between, if that makes sense, that tries to make the gap smaller. So I think things like that could be a really beneficial way of maybe thinking a bit more deeply about how you might be able to help specifically in an organisation, especially if you're an organisation that has a kind of area of land that you manage as well.
We've got another question in the Q&A. Which habitats are classified as irreplaceable in the next game?
So you do have kind of, I'll be honest with you, it would be that's a better question for a proper ecologist, but there are certain habitats that are definitely classified as, more, more important, or more, kind of, they have higher scoring than others within the metrics. So things like ancient woodland and stuff are really, really highly classified. You can't kind of get rid of, they have a really, really high value. So yeah, different habitats have got different values, and you need to take that into account when you're using the metric. And the biodiversity metric is also, it's not for what you would call irreplaceable habitats, which are kind of protected sites and that kind of stuff. Quick wins in a small garden. So I think with that, maybe things like native species. So making sure, or looking at species that you can kind of, are just beneficial to biodiversity, and not necessarily kind of just for the kind of aesthetic purposes of your garden. So yeah, I would say look at native species, look at potentially creating a pond which creates different diverse habitats, so you've got areas for other species to kind of live and that kind of thing as well, and not using pesticides and herbicides and stuff, because obviously they're specifically designed to kind of to control biodiversity, and actually a lot of those chemicals that you might be using accumulate in the environment and persist for a lot longer than maybe you would like to think, and create problems in the long term. Okay, well, thanks everyone. Hope you enjoyed it. Hope you found it useful, and I'm sure at some point we might see you for another biodiversity webinar in the future.